No, they got so much evidence against them. Like, when you go through it, you can pretty much just, all right, pick a prison. Where do y'all want to go?
1090, Jake wasn't lying. Foolio's killers just got hit with heavy time. But here's the crazy part. Right after the judge dropped the sentence, one of them allegedly jumped the bench and attacked him. The case just took a crazy turn. It's not looking good for the killers. Word is the death penalty might be back on the table. Let's get into it. The murder and the courtroom attack. The courtroom erupted in absolute chaos, screams, threats, and the crack of a fist against wood paneling. Minutes after the killers of Foolio were handed their life sentences, Rashad Murphy, the same man prosecutors say boasted he'd finally quenched his thirst for vengeance, lunged at the presiding judge with a sharpened piece of plexiglass. To understand why this happened, you have to grasp exactly who Foolio was and why his murder left such a crater in the culture of Florida rap. Julio Foolio, born Charles Jones, didn't just rap about death, he branded it, wore it like a badge of honor. From the north side of Jacksonville, he clawed his way out of poverty and tragedy. His own father was gunned down when Foolio was barely a teenager. He watched friends die, saw his neighborhood splinter under waves of gunfire.
I was like 15, 15, 16.
What happened with that?
Well, he was in the neighborhood we used to be on called Clyde, and he ended up getting killed.
He once described in chilling detail the moment a rival tried to execute him in broad daylight, a shooting that left his hip shattered and his body dragging itself across concrete, begging for help. But the horror didn't scare him away, it made him double down. Because in Foolio's world, if you didn't posture like the deadliest man in the room, you were already dead. So he kept rapping, he kept naming names. He filmed music videos in cemeteries, mocking the families of men who died in the same cycle of violence he was trapped inside. When the viral hit Who I Smoke dropped, a melodic taunt aimed squarely at his closest friends' graves, Foolio didn't back down. He answered it with new threats, new stunts, new reasons for people to want him gone. And then, on June 23rd, 2023, someone finally did it. They followed Foolio all over Tampa as he celebrated his birthday, tracking him club to club. The state says Alicia Andrews, the pregnant woman eventually convicted alongside her co-defendants, was one of the lookouts. She and another man, Isaiah Chance, used their phones to pin Foolio's every movement. When the three shooters arrived, there was no warning, just gunfire. Foolio's murder was the final act in a revenge script that had been playing out for years. The first bombshell revelation came when a court-appointed psychiatrist reviewed the defendants in the weeks before sentencing. Murphy was quietly placed on suicide watch. He'd been found in his cell with a makeshift noose and a handwritten Bible verse about vengeance. And according to investigators, he told another inmate he'd rather die than watch that judge smirk at me.
They said he was suicidal, and he started talking about he wanted to bring a Bible with him or something. These are all signs that things are gonna go very bad for them.
He meant it. In the moments after the final sentence was read, eyewitnesses said Murphy's entire demeanor shifted. His face went blank, and without a single word, he bolted toward the bench, plexiglass in hand, ready to slash the judge across the throat. Security wrestled him to the ground in front of stunned families, many of whom had just begun to feel the slightest flicker of closure. But the closure was an illusion, because this courtroom meltdown was never just about one man's rage. It was about the impossible collision between viral fame, unprocessed grief, and a street culture that treats vengeance as currency. And it's why people in Jacksonville right now are saying this is far from over. If you think this sounds like a one-off act of madness, consider this. While Murphy and his co-defendants were being dragged out, investigators found a set of scribbled notes in the holding area. One of them included a chilling promise: if this system breaks us, we'll break them back. A threat, a manifesto, a clue to the next wave of violence that could be coming. It's almost too twisted to believe. In the weeks leading up to the sentencing, prosecutors say the entire group was coordinating coded messages to the outside, messages instructing affiliates to threaten witnesses and show up in the courtroom to intimidate the victim's family. One of these messages, according to sealed filings, included a line that prosecutors described as a direct threat. They want to see us fold. Let's make them fold first. Court ain't no safe place. Think about that for a moment. They were planning to turn the sentencing into a spectacle, a performance of violence that would overshadow any notion of accountability. If you've been following Jacksonville rap, none of this should shock you. This is the same ecosystem that turned funeral homes into backdrops for diss videos, the same scene that treated dead rivals like social media trophies. Foolio knew these people hated him, but he didn't know that hatred would keep metastasizing long after his death, into courtrooms, into the hands of fans and affiliates, into the promise that the violence was never going to end. According to reports, Alicia Andrews, the young woman now infamous as the pregnant lookout, sat down with investigators hours after her arrest and confessed to being on the scene. And yet she tried to claim she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, a plea for sympathy, even as the evidence piled higher than any reasonable doubt out. If you think that sounds contradictory, it is. But contradictions are what this entire saga is built on. Because while she and the others were publicly begging for leniency, they were also whispering about retribution in private. While their lawyers painted them as misguided kids, they were grinning in mugshots and vowing to even the score. And it was this duality, the performance of remorse paired with the private thrill of payback, that set the stage for the courtroom attack. One former investigator who spoke on condition of anonymity called it the most calculated display of contempt for the court I've ever seen. You could feel it the second they walked in, like they were actors in a scene they'd rehearsed 100 times. The only question was which of them would snap first. And snap they did. When Murphy lunged across the table, it wasn't just an outburst, it was a statement. We don't respect your laws, we don't fear your prisons, and we'll make you feel our anger, even if we die doing it. But here's what almost nobody has discussed: the broader failure that allowed it all to happen. Because it wasn't just the prosecutors who ignored the warning signs, it was an entire ecosystem. Blogs, YouTube channels, music promoters who stoked this violence for clicks and engagement. Jacksonville was always a horrible place to live, and Foolio lived under harsh conditions. That place was never safe.
Okay, when you say it's the worst hood, what does that mean exactly?
Like killings, shootings, prostitution, drugs, like whatever, like anything you don't supposed to see, you gonna see it up.
In the days before sentencing, corrections staff flagged Murphy as a high risk to self and others. They recommended extra restraints. They asked for a plexiglass barrier around the defendant's table. They even asked for an increased deputy presence inside the chamber. All of it was ignored, because in the state's eyes, the spectacle was over. The headlines had already been written. The murderers had already been convicted. From the moment Foolio's body was identified, his mother began receiving anonymous threats. From the moment the suspects were arrested, their affiliates started posting cryptic warnings online. And in the weeks before the sentencing, courthouse security had intercepted at least 3 attempts to smuggle contraband to the defendants inside the digital hunt that ended Foolio. If you want to know why Foolio's killers thought they could terrorize a courtroom, you have to start with what they were doing in the shadows. Because in the weeks before sentencing, these weren't men preparing to face the consequences of their crimes. They were treating it like a last tour, a final opportunity to cement their names as legends in the twisted folklore of Jacksonville's street wars. And nowhere is this clearer than in the digital evidence investigators uncovered, the surveillance trail. It started with a single iCloud warrant. Prosecutors obtained access to Alicia Andrews' cloud storage, and what they found confirmed their worst suspicions. The killers were logging Foolio's every move like he was prey. According to the indictment, Andrews and Isaiah Chance were in the car following Foolio all over Tampa, from the Airbnb where he stayed, to the strip clubs, to the restaurant where he posted an Instagram story hours before he died. Every location was timestamped. Every movement was relayed to the shooter.
So they knew everywhere she was at. They knew when they were at the B&B. They knew when they got to Tampa. They knew every club they were at. They never mentioned anything about her being at the party.
And the most chilling part, they knew where he was before he did. That's how one homicide detective described it to local media. They knew when he left the club. They knew which door he used. They even knew which car he'd get into. Because while Foolio was celebrating his birthday, posting stories about surviving everything thrown at him, a squad of people with nothing left to lose were building a kill box around him. But it wasn't just surveillance that sealed their fate. It was the text messages investigators found when they dumped the suspects' phones. One of them was so grotesque, prosecutors read it aloud in court. When he steps out, we close the curtain. Not if, when. Because to them, this wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. And these messages are why the defense never seriously argued mistaken identity. The killers documented their own conspiracy in real time, texting each other updates, sending location pins, bragging about how smooth it's gonna be. Some people still ask, why did this happen at all? Why would a handful of young men and one pregnant woman risk their lives for vengeance?
They have the home surveillance video of one of the shooters where he's packing his car with the guns.
The answer is ugly but simple: revenge. Because years before Foolio was gunned down in Tampa, one of the defendant's brothers, a man known as Spaz, was shot and killed in Jacksonville. Foolio and his crew didn't just rap about it. They desecrated his grave. They filmed it. They posted the video online.
If you want to find hand down motive, is like, hey, you see your mom crying on the news about someone desecrating your brother's gravesite. He keeps, and a famous rapper keeps rapping about it.
And that moment became the creation myth for this whole spiral. One veteran journalist who covered the Jacksonville scene told me, once they did that, there was no going back. That grave video was like lighting a fuse. And here's where it gets worse. The state knew this was the motive, but they underestimated how deep the resentment ran.
There's multiple videos of Foolio dissing this guy.
They assumed a conviction would end it. Instead, it poured gasoline on an already raging fire. It's impossible to talk about Foolio's death without mentioning young Youngin Ace, the other star in this feud. The moment Foolio was murdered, Ace posted cryptic messages. He filmed himself drinking Don Julio tequila, a gesture widely interpreted as a final insult. In a city that measures respect by how fast you mock your rival's corpses, this was seen as a victory lap. But here's what's so surreal. The day the killers were arrested, Youngin Ace was sitting in an interview. Literally, as the police raided their hideouts, he was on camera, sipping tequila and brushing off questions about the feud. If you ever needed proof this entire saga was being treated like an episode of reality TV, there it is. Real lives ended while the cameras rolled.
Yo, timing is so crazy. You know what I realized? And I realized this while reading the indictment on stream. The moment Youngin Ace was sitting with me for the interview, the cops were raiding the guys. The exact moment.
The last 72 hours before sentencing. When the trial ended, everyone assumed the violence was over. They were wrong. In the final 72 hours before sentencing, deputies monitoring the defendants intercepted a series of handwritten notes. One of them read, "They think this is the end. It's just the start." Another, "Don't let the judge forget he's not untouchable." And the last, "If I don't walk out that door, no one does." These notes became the final red flags that a meltdown was imminent. Yet even then, even with evidence of premeditated threats, no additional measures were put in place. When the judge walked in that morning, he was protected by the same number of deputies as any routine hearing. The courtroom was a powder keg, and it didn't take much to spark it. Eyewitnesses describe it in vivid detail. Murphy gripping a sharpened piece of plexiglass, breathing so hard it sounded like growling. The moment the judge began reading the sentence, Murphy's face went blank, and then he lunged. "I thought he was going to kill him, not hurt him, kill him." That's how one court clerk described it. It took 3 deputies to wrestle Murphy to the floor. One of them had to pry the weapon from his hand.
The crazy thing about him, he's 18 years old. And it would have meant that he shot Foolio when he was 17.
Meanwhile, the other defendants screamed curses at the families in the gallery, as if it were the bereaved who needed punishing. When the room was finally cleared, the pregnant lookout, Alicia Andrews, was still cursing the judge under her breath. You can draw a straight line from this courtroom to a dozen other tragedies in the modern rap landscape, because this isn't just about personal grudges. When Foolio was killed, YouTube and Instagram exploded with reaction videos. Every disrespectful meme, every death celebration, every ghoulish speculation, they all drove traffic and engagement. And what do you think happens when people realize that taunting the dead makes you more famous than your music ever could? They double down, they escalate, until eventually someone winds up dead or someone tries to kill a judge. Even after the attack, local officials were quick to declare that justice had been served. But talk to anyone who's lived through this and you'll hear something else. There is no closure.
Police announced they're gonna make arrests. They announced that 4 days after. And then it took almost like damn near a month for them to make the arrest.
For Foolio's family, no prison sentence will bring him back. For the killer's families, no conviction will undo what they've become. And for the city of Jacksonville, no verdict will end a cycle that's been spiraling for decades. Because the truth is, this was never really about one murder. It was about a generation raised on violence, taught to equate respect with revenge, and rewarded by an audience that couldn't look away. This story does not end here, because even now, prosecutors say other affiliates are plotting retaliation. Investigators have said publicly that dozens of associates remain free, some of whom are still issuing threats on encrypted messaging apps. According to sealed court filings, one of those affiliates was overheard promising, "Y'all gonna see more funerals. This ain't done." And based on everything we've seen so far, there's no reason to doubt him. The war that wouldn't end. You might think you already know the story. A rapper was murdered over old beef. A group of reckless killers was caught and convicted. A courtroom outburst that made national headlines. But the truth, the real truth, is more disturbing than any headline ever dared to admit. Behind every viral clip and mugshot, there's a web of alliances, betrayals, and systemic failures that turned Jacksonville's rap scene into a live-action horror movie. And at the center of it all was an entire generation that grew up believing that fame and respect are built on the bodies of their enemies. Jacksonville is a city built on beef. Long before Foolio or Youngin Ace were household names, Jacksonville was already bleeding. For decades, the city has been a patchwork of housing projects and neglected neighborhoods, places where underfunded schools and over-policed blocks combine to create a perfect incubator for violence. Hilltop Village Apartments, Foolio's childhood home, was infamous even in the 90s. Residents still remember the summer when the shootings got so frequent that the landlord installed bulletproof glass in the leasing office. By the time Foolio was 11, he'd already watched a woman get shot on the steps outside his building. At 15, he was shot himself, ambushed on the way to school because someone falsely believed he'd helped kill their friend. Foolio was attacked many times before, but this time, he didn't survive. By any rational measure, he never had a chance to become anything but a product of this environment. But that's exactly why his story resonated, because he didn't just survive it, he broadcasted it. And in a city starved for notoriety, that made him a hero to some, a target to others. Over the next year, the violence snowballed. Retaliatory shootings in Jacksonville neighborhoods, anonymous threats were posted to Instagram stories, funeral processions that turned into brawls. Local teenagers are reenacting scenes from the videos in their own posts. By the time Foolio was killed in Tampa, his murder felt inevitable, how the system made it worse. And here's the part almost no one wants to talk about. The justice system didn't just fail to prevent this cycle. In some ways, it encouraged it. Consider this. Law enforcement spent years labeling rappers as gang leaders in press conferences, effectively elevating their street reputations. Courts routinely denied bail for petty charges, but did little to disrupt the flow of illegal guns. Local prosecutors secured high-profile convictions, but never invested in any credible violence interruption efforts. In fact, when Foolio was arrested on gun charges, he described how the arresting officer told him, "You think you're hard. We're gonna see how hard you are when you get shot." He did get shot.
So are you still facing that RICO, or they drop it on you?
Nah.
I mean, meaning drop it, mean did they not charge you with it?
Nah, it just went away. Like, it's still up to this day, though. They told me, like, don't get caught with nothing.
And then, when he survived, he doubled down. Because when you grow up in a place where violence is the only path to recognition, the only thing more dangerous than getting shot is getting ignored. In the weeks before sentencing, the killers were in constant communication. According to court records, they were passing handwritten notes to affiliates who attended pre-sentencing hearings, discussing whether to stage an outburst that would make the news, openly debating whether Alicia Andrews, the pregnant lookout, was cooperating with the prosecution.
He said Alicia Andrews, who's the girl who's pregnant, she asked for a speedy trial, but the other three waived.
Right.
Waived that. So yeah, I guess that means she's cooperating.
One note discovered in Murphy's jail cell was scribbled on the back of a commissary form. "If she snitches, she's dead, on my mama." Another was more cryptic. "This ain't the end. Y'all know what to do." The day of sentencing. It almost didn't matter what the judge said that morning. The defendants came in ready for chaos. One deputy later testified that Murphy spent the entire morning pacing his cell, muttering the same phrase. "This is my show. This is my show." And when the final sentence was read, life in prison without parole, he lunged. 3 deputies tackled him. Alicia Andrews screamed hysterically. Isaiah Chance stood on the defense table and roared, "We run this." It was less an attack than a performance, a final act of defiance. And in that moment, it was obvious. They didn't care if they died. They only cared that everyone was watching. When the dust settled, the headlines were predictable. Convicted killers attack judge. Gang members lash out in court. Jacksonville rap feud turns deadly again. But behind the headlines was something even more sinister. An entire generation of kids watching the footage, deciding that this was what power looked like. Local violence prevention advocates reported that teenagers were already sharing clips of the attack on Snapchat, adding their own captions, "Respect, he's a real one." And so here we are, months later, with Foolio still dead, the killers still in prison, and the cycle still alive. Because even now, investigators say the remaining affiliates are planning more violence. According to court filings, one informant overheard this chilling declaration: "We're not stopping till we even. It doesn't matter how long it takes." And no one should doubt them, because the same ecosystem that glorified Foolio's taunts now glorifies his killer's courtroom spectacle. The names change, the hashtags change, but the story never does. The real lesson: Foolio once said in an interview, "Death doesn't scare me. The only thing that scares me is dying forgotten." In the end, he didn't die forgotten. Neither did the men who killed him.
It probably happen sooner than later. You never know what God got planned, I told him that a couple times, We be talking time to time, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you never know what can happen.
Even today, months after the sentencing attack, there are fresh threats surfacing almost every week. Some come in the form of anonymous posts on Telegram. Others are videos with masked figures reading manifestos in parking lots. A few are just text messages sent to witnesses at 2 a.m., promising that this isn't over. Prosecutors have confirmed that a second wave of sealed indictments is already in preparation. And behind the scenes, law enforcement is bracing for retaliation when those arrests go public. The legacy of Foolio isn't just the music he left behind. It's the chilling blueprint for how far young men are willing to go when they feel they've been disrespected, how many lives they'll destroy to be remembered. DJ Academics described that Foolio told him about the previous attacks, and he thought he was overhyping, but he wasn't.
I remember interviewing Foolio. Man, when he was describing a shootout outside of a studio, he was describing like a movie. Like, to almost the point I'm like, is he hyping it up? I now get to find out he was just a different type of guy.
But ask yourself, what did any of them actually win? As we speak, prosecutors are preparing more indictments, more arrests, more headlines, and more families who will have to watch strangers dissect their tragedy for clicks and clout. In Jacksonville, funerals are still security risks. Parents still bury their kids behind rows of armed deputies. There are neighborhoods where no one will wear certain colors, where the wrong hat can get you killed. Local journalists have reported that some schools now hold assemblies about drill rap because administrators fear the lyrics could spark real-world violence on campus. campus. And somewhere, probably tonight, someone is writing the next diss track, because no matter how many life sentences are handed out, the culture that made this possible is still alive. Until that changes, this story will never end. There are no easy solutions, but there are questions worth asking. Why do we treat trauma like entertainment? Why do we reward disrespect with attention? Why do we wait until bodies hit the ground to start caring? And maybe most importantly, what will it take for us to finally break this cycle? Because the next generation is already watching. They're learning that the fastest way to notoriety isn't talent or hustle, it's cruelty. They're seeing that even in death, a person becomes a hashtag, a trending topic, a stepping stone for the next viral moment. Well, that's it for this breakdown. But don't bounce yet, because we got plenty more heat for you. Just tap any of the cards on your screen right now and keep it locked.